Third session, and we're focusing this afternoon on material culture and cognition. And our first pair of speakers are going to address nature and artifice, categorizing things. And so first, I would like to introduce Mónica. We have here Mónica Domínguez Torres, who's an associate professor and associate chair in the Department of Art History at the University of Delaware. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Okay, here I am. So for my contribution to the volume, I decided to focus on a particular tiny object that is currently on display at the Walters Museum in Baltimore in the Chamber of Wonders. That's the case on the left where it is displayed, so better view. And then there in the corner there, that's the object, okay? So if you miss it, I don't blame you, okay? So, much better view now. So I decided to focus on this particular object because I think it opens up very interesting issues. I'm going to try to outline in these 10 minutes 4 of them, even though they are not really fully articulated in the draft I circulated, but I think I may be able to gather more ideas to fully develop this essay. So the first issue that this tiny object seems to address is the issue of function, which is a pearl pendant, as you can see. So we will usually think that this is a piece of, as a jewel that is meant to be worn. Has many pearls at the time in the 16th, 17th, 18th century were worn. But actually, this type of pendant using has the main material, the Baroque pearl, those irregular pearls, actually were not meant to be worn, but actually were collectibles that stay in Wunderkammer, has the display at the Walters really nicely shows. So it's a collectible. It was basically an object to be observed, to be studied, and what we can call an object of virtue. And in many cases also this object circulated has a diplomatic gift. I must add that we have very little information about the object itself, so a lot of what I'm saying here just basically comes out of what I have in front. The second issue that I think this particular object brings up is its materiality, like what it is made out. So the first and the main ingredient, so to speak, here is this Baroque pearl in the center that you see here. That's the reason of why this was made. And pearls, of course, had a very important place in early modern culture, not only because this particular type of pearls, these irregular pearls, were rare, difficult to find, and therefore very valuable in terms of monetary value, but also because it had a lot of interest for medicinal purposes. Pearls were thought to have properties that could cure many maladies, and also because they were even used as talismans in many occasions. So they had all these kind of practical functions, so to speak, as well. And part of that stems from the fact that the origins of pearls were considered kind of mysterious. Since Pliny the Elder, pearls were thought to originate from a kind of dewdrop that was captured, a kind of a stay inside of the oyster where pearls were found. And this idea that then this was the origin of the pearl was in the air combined with the water, then created this idea that this was one of the few elements or few things in nature that combine both air and water. So it kind of conveyed the properties of those two elements, but also of the planets, the astral bodies that were associated with these elements. And on the other hand, a peculiarity of pearls is that they are the only kind of gem of organic origin. So it's not a mineral, it's actually originated from an animal. So that also kind of added to the kind of understanding of pearl has a kind of very interesting kind of element to study. So in that sense, they were in this Wunderkammer usually included in the site of naturalia of all these natural elements that were meant to be studied. And of course, that were then classified and categorized and tried to make sense within the larger organization of the world. The second aspect of this is, of course, the issue of craftsmanship, of the work that is involved in creating this kind of object. So this particular pendant belongs to a kind of larger family of many of these other pendants that were created at the time, using different pearls, and then creating out of the original shape of the pearl a kind of recognizable motif. So this was something in which, an activity in which great artists were involved, like Albert Studer, the German Albert Studer, or the French Etienne Delon. So these artists were actually creating. So these are today we kind of consider like a minor art kind of thing like that, but it was not actually. It was tackled by major artists as well, and some of them even created. Okay, it's not moving. Okay, now it's moving. Created books with printed books with ornaments and designs for using this kind of gems. And I mean, they were proud of those creations where they could display this kind of sense of mastery of nature that was so important, such an important concept in the Renaissance. So it was a reflection of the artist's ingenuity of being able to create new things, new motif out of irregular shapes that were provided by nature. And these two aspects, the element of the materiality of these pendants and the craftsmanship, were not completely unrelated at this particular time. Actually, many of these disquisitions at the time about this kind of objects were presented together in the treatises of the time, like this particular book by Anselmus Boethius, the Latinized name, but he's actually a Flemish writer. I would say scientist, but because it's a treatise in gemology, but he actually dealt there with the technique to pierce pearls. So he deals with elements that we will consider usually the work of a jeweler, but also talks about the origin of pearls and the theories around the origins of pearls. And actually, he's the first one to advance the idea that pearls are actually the tumor of an oyster, which is, the real thing that happens. And he drops the theory of Pliny the Elder of the dewdrop. So this kind of shows and contextualizes how people were really thinking carefully about this kind of materials and about this kind of objects. The last issue I want to bring up is the issue of iconography. We see that many of those pendants that were created at the time revolve around sea themes, sea-related themes, like marine monsters, or like the siren in the middle, and even a caravel, which to me, in conjunction to the pendant that I'm concerned about, seem to indicate that there is also an element of reflexivity in the sense of thinking about the industry that actually brought about these particular gems to Europe. And of course, here what we have in the first case is a black captive, and we can see his manos shackled in the back. And he almost always kind of, it's an element that's related to many of the chronicles of the time, New World Chronicles in particular, and the use of black slaves for the fishing of pearls. That was, it was necessary element. There was no industry if it wasn't because of black slaves, at least in the Atlantic world. And this is a kind of element that sometimes is kind of overlooked, that this was a kind of very, very important component. First, in the Caribbean, the Europeans used indigenous divers to retrieve the pearls. When these indigenous divers were no longer available, because they basically exterminated most of them, then they had to import black slaves. And these ideas that the pearl fishing industry was completely associated to the possession of black slaves as well, it is recorded in not only in the chronicles, but also in a work of art of the time, like this one by Jacopo Zucchi. So also, we can see, and I'm not going to go in detail in there, other work of art of the same time, around the same time, making that kind of association between pearls. These two figures of black porters are holding in their trays pearls. And this seems to be, again, associated with that kind of industry, because if we pay attention, for example, to the way on how these figurines are dressed, they are actually imitating New World drawings like those by Theodore Debris. So there is this kind of very strong connection, at least in the imaginary at the time, between black slaves and the pearl industry that is known, and that's an information that is circulating. The other element, of course, is the fact that this is a kind of Oriental garb kind of slave. So I would like to argue that it is a reflection of the understanding of the pearl industry as a global kind of industry, and the idea of a myth, actually, I think, of Oriental pearls like being of higher quality, a myth emphasized by the fact that European markets didn't have easy access to those pearls, and that also kind of politically is strengthened by the fact that at the time the Turk, as they were called, or the Oriental forces were kind of very disquieting kind of and threatening kind of force for European circles, ruling circles, who will be actually circulating and collecting these kind of things. Okay, thank you.
Paper in this pair, I'd like to introduce Stephen Conn, who's the professor and director of the Public History program at Ohio State University. So,
thank you, Sarah. And thank you for having me here. We've come to the point in the afternoon where we can answer that age-old nursery school question, which of these things doesn't belong here? Because that is, in fact, me. If you had a chance to glance at my paper fragment, I did put my cards on the table. I'm not really a scholar of material culture. So it does beg the question why Ivan and Sarah had me here in the first place, but it's a lovely opportunity to come and talk with all of you. The title of my paper, as I now race against the tyranny of the ladybug, is called Words or Things in American History. And some of you will recognize that I have shamelessly stolen that from John Cohenhoven's now classic essay, Words or Things in American Studies. I've always felt that plagiarism was the highest form of flattery, so I hope he won't mind. It's an essay I picked up when I was thinking about this paper in this symposium, because as it happens, it's also having its 50th anniversary this year. It was published in 1964, and I think it's fair to say that in many ways it really initiated a whole set of conversations about how to use material things in our study of American culture. That's what interested him. I want to focus maybe a little bit more on American history. And you know, several years, a lot of years really, before historians took the so-called linguistic turn when we began to read objects, and I share Henry's suspicion about that, Cohenhoven challenged the primacy of written sources over material ones altogether in helping us to understand the past. Verbal symbols, he wrote, are inherently defective. They are at best a sort of generalized, averaged out substitute for a complex reality comprising an infinite number of individual particularities. And he went on to say that if we wanted to get at the history, the experience, and so forth of what he termed non-scribbling America, which now we all hang our heads in shame, which had largely been left out of American historical writing, certainly by up to 1964, then we had to engage not only with a whole world of what he called vernacular objects, but, and here we go again, Henry, to develop what he called sensory thinking. My brief for this project is to consider the relationship between material culture and cognition, and I'm going to quote here just so that we're clear about what I'm supposed to do. Choosing, making, and using material things to be part of the machinery of human thought, including emotions and know-how. That's a tall order, and it sort of left me with a set of conundrums, and so taking my cue from William James, who famously said, as soon as you are faced with a conundrum, draw a distinction, and so that's what I'm going to do. I began to wonder whose cognition we were really talking about here. Was it the cognition of those people who make, mold, manufacture, or otherwise produce the objects themselves, or is it the cognition of those of us engaged with trying to extract some kind of meaning out of those objects themselves? Cohenhoven insisted that in order to develop what he called direct sensory awareness of vernacular objects, that this was the way we could gain an important knowledge about American culture. But it really begs, I think, a set of methodological questions, which I think Henry also raised for us a moment ago. Is all sensory thinking the same? Are the results to different methodological approaches to material culture, do they yield different or contradictory results? Does sensory thinking change over time? As historians now begin to wrestle with what some have called the affective turn, I think these are some of the questions that come up. Does affect in the 17th century, is that's the same in the 21st century, and if not, how are we ever going to know it? All of this, as I said, sort of questions that are raised in trying to figure out just how exactly we're going to use material things to reckon with the past. Cohenhoven pitted language and material culture against each other because he thought language was slippery and inherently unreliable, but objects were fixed and unchanging, but I'm not sure too many of us around the table would agree with that anymore. So where does that leave us in terms of negotiating these divides? So as I said, and I'll say again, my own interest is not necessarily in how to understand material culture, the way so many of you around the table have done so well already. My own work has explored how people have used or thought they could use objects to convey various kinds of knowledge, including knowledge about the past. In a nutshell, I've been interested in how objects helped constitute bodies of knowledge in, let's say, call it the second half of the 19th century and maybe the first years of the 20th century. And I use a term, object-based epistemology, that there was a belief on the part of a lot of these folks in the late 19th century that if you simply collected, classified, and observed objects carefully enough, they would yield up information, knowledge about given bodies of knowledge, and I can go into that more if you're interested. I studied this, I've done a little bit of work on the history of American museums, and which is where I see this all taking place. But it's also the case that museums became less and less important across the 20th century as sites for knowledge production, replaced crudely and simply by universities and the research agendas there. So when Cohenhoven published his manifesto in 1964, it hit the way that it did precisely because objects by that point really did not any longer figure much into the study of the past, at least by American historians studying American history. We are, I think, still mostly historians around the room, people of the word. That's what we do. That's still how the vast bulk of the sources we rely on, and it's the way we transmit what it is we think we have learned out into the public. But I'm also struck, and here maybe a little bit sort of in my role as a public historian, that there are all kinds of ways in which material culture does play a role in how other audiences interact with the past, if not exactly academic historians at the AHA and elsewhere. So I began to think about categorizing those venues, the places where it seems to me material culture intersects a wider audience and facilitates their interaction with history. And so what I want to look at, I hope, unless you tell me otherwise, in the chapter for this volume, is to look at three areas where I see this happening. The first of these is history and the museum enterprise. Of all of the vast encyclopedic museum projects that took place in the last half of the 19th century, I mean, we're just down the street from the American Museum of Natural History, we're just across the park from the Met, the History Museum turned out to be the most problematic to build. I've argued that problem exists at two levels. First is a narrative level. What narrative did these museums want to convey through its exhibits? Science and anthropology museums have the advantage of putting on display an approximately evolutionary narrative, sort of from simplest to most complex, from most primitive to most civilized, or whatever it happens to be. And the second problem is, how can that narrative be told using objects? I think what material culture studies has demonstrated really quite breathtakingly in some instances is the capacity to move from the singular out into much broader sets of questions. But if you're going to construct a museum of history, can you string together a set of singular objects that tell a larger story so that the narrative, the museum narrative, becomes somehow greater than the sum of the exhibit parts? And I think that's really been a problem, which may help explain why there really is no encyclopedic National Museum of American History. The National Museum of American History itself is probably the least intellectually coherent of any of the Smithsonian museums on the mall. It's just an attic of stuff. Sort of First Lady dresses next to the Krispy Kreme donut, the original Krispy Kreme donut machine, I should say. There's no narrative there at all in the way that you would get it at an art museum or elsewhere. The big picture, the overarching narrative of American history is missing. And I think when you look across the landscape of history museums, what you notice is that the vast majority of them are local, maybe regional. That's the story that gets told. And so trying to figure out how you would create a larger narrative out of these smaller fragments, I think, has been a real problem. The American Museum of Natural History down the street can tell the story of the dinosaurs, but nobody has really figured out the story of American history, much less how to put it on display. But at the same time, I think there are a number of what we might call non-traditional museums that have developed across the middle of the 20th century, which offer visitors an immersion experience in the past and material culture central to those attempts. I'm thinking primarily of Henry Ford's Greenfield Village, which is a product of the 1920s, and Williamsburg, also a product of the 1920s, though it didn't really kind of get off its own launch pad for a little while after that. I do think that there's, when you think about the experience that the visiting public has in those, that immersion in a material world at Williamsburg is quite remarkable, especially the material world of labor. When you get to watch this woman sitting, oh my goodness gracious, well, there we are. So let me just quickly say, I lost the race. I want to look at how material culture has functioned in the setting of history museums, or whether it needs to function there anymore, because lots of museums have now been built that don't rely on objects at all. I'm thinking of the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati, which opened about 10 years ago. I want to look also at how we use material culture to teach the past. Because I think most of us, though again, we are people of the word, connect to the past in our own ways in an effective relationship with actual stuff. We don't generally provide our students or anybody we teach with those same experiences, and we might think about what that might mean. And then finally, I want to glance just very briefly at what the explosion of the virtual world will mean for material culture practice and study. If those immersion experiences, like this of the sort that Colleen describes, where you dress up and you get to play with the old tools and whatnot, but if I can do that better with Google Glasses, if I can create a more fully immersed sense of being in the past, do I need material objects anymore, or are we really talking about a whole different realm now of materiality? So I'll stop there with apologies for not timing this well, but thank you very much.
Beautiful and pretty and interesting, something that is really one of the great atrocities. Well, hiding it and not, right? Because he's bound. I mean, he is hiding. I mean, that's the thing. It's like a prettification of something, but it's not hiding the fact that he is right there enslaved. You know, it's
glorifying it, actually.
Yeah.
That's the most problematic part. It's glorifying it, and I think for the audiences of the time, there were no issues about it.
Well, for the white audiences.
Of course, for who collected those kind of issues, those were usually a very important ruling, actually, individuals that, of course, believe in that kind of natural order thing. And for them, actually, I think in some ways an object like that will remind them about the need to keep preserving that natural order. And that's, I think, why this reference to the Orient is important, because they were not the dominion of that side of the world. And I think it was a kind of important element as a reminder. But yeah, I completely agree with you. When I saw it, and I saw it that anything in the case, I couldn't believe it, how blatant it was.
I'll just say really quickly as a really quick follow-up that so I'm a philosopher and I work on the relationship between aesthetic value and moral value. And if you're interested, there's a big discussion in philosophy about the relationship between, representations of moral atrocities and their purported aesthetic value or whatever. So those are all the kinds of issues it raised for me that I
Question for Stephen. I found the discussion of the History Museum as a problem very interesting. And I'm wondering if it doesn't, however, point to a more local problem, which is the lack in the United States of a philosophical justification for the History Museum. So the comparative example would be Germany in the first half of the 19th century, and the process that culminates in the founding of the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in 1852, explicitly conceived, originally gestating from the 1830s, as a national repertory of regional museums devoted to cultural historical artifacts. Mm-hmm. And there, I think, there's more specificity because you can do the spade work on the reaction to Kant by Herder, the reaction against Herder. Essentially, this is a kind of Hegelianism one step removed that has a context to explain how you can have garden implements next to clothing, next to bed chambers, right? And that philosophical grounding is what, I guess, is or isn't present in the United States.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why the History Museum enterprise went the way that it did. I think, and so there are nitty-gritty and maybe a little boring sets of institutional questions, financial questions. I mean, that's an interesting comparison to draw, which I frankly had not thought about before. There are attempts across the 19th century in a number of European countries to create national museums of blank history, or the blank nation. And I guess I mean, I still remain perplexed, given how contested the creation of this nation was, and even, you know, well into the 19th century, why that similar impulse wasn't quite there. And, you know, again, maybe this also has to do a little bit with a kind of geography. The place to locate such an institution would have been in Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. is not a particularly consequential place until the 20th century, really till the 1930s. The big museum building is all local. It's Chicago competing against New York, and it's Philadelphia competing against Boston. And that decentralization of the cultural landscape may also explain a kind of decentralized approach to a historical understanding.
Could I interject here? I'm sorry, and I'm not an expert, but I'm going to pretend I am.
Yes.
And that's to say that there was a conversation around the creation of a national museum with Charles Wilson Peel,
Mm-hmm.
and even before that with a gentleman that no one remembers, and I don't remember his first name, perhaps it's Philippe.
Cimetière, oui.
Here's my associate's friend. But that's to say, yes, there was a hotly contested conversation around that, and you know, here Peel came pretty close to that, and there wasn't. Yes, you have these competing interests in various cities, but it was going to be Philadelphia as the city
Right.
of that national museum.
So the distinction that I would draw there, though, is that Peel never imagined a museum of American history. He imagined a museum which would, in the way that it would emerge by the late 19th century, sort of history as it professionalized in the last half of the 19th century. Peel's collection included, it was going to be an American museum. It was going to have portraits of the great people. It was going to have the mastodons and the stuffed birds, which were unique to the United States. But I think in terms, you know, so by the time that the encyclopedic museums are parsing out, there's art, there's anthropology, there's history, there's science, there's technology. History is the one of those that doesn't quite gel. That's what I would.
Laurel and then Marla.
Okay. One very interesting papers, and the juxtaposition is fascinating, and I'm going to come back to Anne's point, because the concept of a National Museum of American History against the aestheticization of the slave trade is central to that problem right there. And my argument would be, back to Stephen, although I assign your book every semester and appreciate it deeply, is that yes, we need to teach history through artifacts, but those are not the artifacts that are just the artifacts that are hidden in our little history museums. They're the pearl pendants, they're the stuffed birds, they're all of those museums that, and I would say every one of those museums that you describe so powerfully in your book are history museums
Yeah, you know,
right now.
That's right.
And as historians, we need to find a way to make that visible and to do exciting things.
You know, so
There's my manifesto.
Yeah, no, and to paraphrase, it's either John Kenneth Galbraith or Jerry Garcia. In the long run, it's all history.
Yeah.
So I completely agree that at the end of the
But
day,
there's an integrated story there that's quite powerful,
Yeah.
as you have shown.
Yeah.
Marla, did you?
Well, actually, I was going to say, I probably wouldn't have said it as nicely as you said it, but speaking from the point of view of a museum person, I think that what Mónica has shown us is how much an object can tell us, and how many stories you can tease out of the object, and it's incumbent on the institution to use those objects effectively to tell those stories, so that you don't have to have everything. You just have to have carefully, and museums have always been about selection and deselection and deciding what is the impetus for a narrative. And so you use a beautiful object to tell a dark story, or you find another object to tell a different kind of story. And so what Mónica has presented is kind of an antidote to what worries you. And I think that there's a way that this can be solved, you know, through the proper way of doing it.
Tom?
And at one point, also sort of on that, you compared the history museum to an art museum and a natural history museum, and that may be oversimplifying what goes on in an art museum, because that's up for grabs at any given moment. How you would create a narrative, and having worked at both American history and American art, you would be surprised. I think the narrative of American art is perhaps just more artificial than what you see.
No. So sorry. So let me just back up one step. What I was trying to describe was what I see were the difficulties of people 100 years ago trying to build these institutions.
I think you also put your finger on it when you said the rise of Washington museums in the 1930s, because that about coincides when we sort of gave up on writing holistic narrative histories of the United States, and everything became particularized until we started trying to put it back together again.
But I think there's another history that so the Pearl object tells extraordinary stories, and you can do that work in a museum. But going back into the late 19th century, numbers of history museums really went in a very different direction. They became those living history centers of one sort and another. So there was a recognition that somehow putting historical objects in a glass case and having people stare at them wasn't going to connect them with the past in a way that it might connect them with a work of art, or might connect them with a foreign culture in an anthropology collection. So you dressed up in the costumes and you recreated the hand carts pulling the wagons across the desert. And that's a tradition that really goes back to the late 19th century. So there is something about presenting history in the museum that has been, I would say, more troublesome for institution builders than some of these other things.
So we have time for one more question. Denise, did you want to jump in?
The good privilege of the last question. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that came out of something that Stephen said, and I can't resist having such a wonderful audience to ask this question in. So Stephen said that museums became less important as sites of knowledge production as universities began to rise. And one of the questions I've always struggled with is, what if museums are really not that important? What if we think they're important because we're I remember my first trip to the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana when I was a fourth grader, and writing down everything that I saw. And last summer I spent in Hong Kong. We are only allowed to have 4 weeks of research leave outside of Hong Kong per year. And I spent all 4 of those weeks in Shanghai, going from one contact to the next in 40-degree heat, being lost, 40 degrees centigrade, that is, and asking people about their memories of museums of their youth. And day after day I would get this, I don't remember. Why is this interesting? And I did close to 40 interviews, and only 2 people could remember a museum, an exhibition from their childhood, which is very different from people who work on propaganda song, where people can sing the songs or recite the stories or have their favorite poster, the poster that they had in their room. And so sometimes I have this feeling of crisis where maybe if nobody remembers,
that's very unfair.
There's actually an interesting study that's coming out right now, brought to you by Walmart, of crystal bridges and sticky knowledge, and it's pretty fascinating. Kids who come and do a program on genre painting have phenomenal retention a year later of what the Compromise of 1850 was. There's all this interest now. Again, brought to you by Walmart, but it's a pretty amazing study. The executive summary, I think, is out now.
Can you just say the name of it again so that we might find it?
It's
Can you say the name?
Crystal Bridges, which opened a few years ago. They funded a University of Arkansas survey at the same time to track the first, I forget how many thousand school kids through, and so they're trying to get some hard statistics for sticky knowledge on what museums can do with populations that haven't traditionally been exposed to museums. So for those of us who run museums, it's really, really good when you have to go talk to the business community. Because you can say it's brought to you by Walmart.
But it's Arkansas.
It's Arkansas.
It's Arkansas.
Just very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Part of the problems with museums is they are sensory deprivation environments.
Not all of them.
And I work in a museum.
It's not true. We play music now. All the time.
Cold, I get cold, you have to be quiet, and touch. But anyways.
Depends on the museum.
Most museums are not that.
Well, this is a pretty big question that Lisa raised, so maybe we can keep thinking about that as we move forward. Okay, so now the next pair.
Perhaps you should applaud.